and welcome to the 52nd lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. I have been discussing the historical task of recovery that Toni Morrison's novel Beloved is engaged in, and which it also invites readers themselves to initiate and to engage in their own ways. Now, how did Morrison come to this task? What inspired her? So I mentioned in the previous lecture that Morrison was the senior fiction editor for Random House from the years 1967 to 1983. And this was also incidentally the first time that a black woman was appointed to that role. Now, it was during her tenure as senior fiction editor that Morrison supported the careers of a lot of other black writers, including Toni Cade Bambara, Gail Jones, Angela Davis, Huey Newton, and others. It was also during this tenure that Morrison was involved in the development of a very important volume, an anthology documenting Black lives from the time of slavery to the 1920s, that Morrison came across an important piece of historical information. The volume was eventually published as The Black Book in the year 1974. But the information that really stuck with Morrison was something that she collected as a scrapbook of history with patents, photographs, advertisements, and newspaper clippings. And it was a newspaper clipping from the year 1856, which recounted the story of a woman named Margaret Garner. And this article was published in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which in turn was syndicated from the American Baptist. Essentially, the story was that this woman, Margaret Garner, had been imprisoned, and tried for killing her own daughter. And then she had gone through this very long trial, at the end of which she was imprisoned, and very later in life was she actually at the end of this trial. Margaret Garner was returned to her original slave owners. And what struck Morrison while reading and learning about this historical woman, Margaret Garner, was the calmness, was the very solid, firm, and cool resolve with which Margaret Garner defended her position, almost philosophically, defended her decision, and argued in the trial in court that she would do the same thing if she were in that situation again. And essentially, what she was saying is that death was better for a young girl, a newly born girl, her daughter. Death was better than all of the other alternatives that were available to this girl at the time that she was caught by her slave owners. And this stuck with Morrison, and Morrison decided to write a novel about it. So, a couple of things to note. The first is that this story and stories like it were not exactly new information for readers of the novel Beloved when it was published in the year 1987. This is because a lot of historical research had already been published, and so the full extent of the violence, of the absolute annihilation of Black lives, that itself was not unknown. The process of historical recovery, the process of putting on record the fact of the destruction and the annihilation of Black lives was put on record. It was not unknown. So there was something that the novel wanted to do, which the historical record still lacked. And for want of a better word, I'm going to call that lack subjectivity or interiority, or what it feels like to live a human life. The everyday felt and lived textures of a human life. This is what was lacking from the historical record, because the historical record could only give numbers and facts like when did a person die, when was a person born, if there was any legally reported facts like if they were imprisoned, if they were caught, if they were returned, to slavery, if they were released from slavery. These are some information. This does not describe how the person felt when something happened. This was lacking. So, in some ways, by writing a novel that describes the inner thoughts, the inner life, the motivation, the aspirations, the dreams, the anxieties, the fears, the guilt of a woman like Margaret Garner, who decided, out of the utmost care and love for her daughter, to kill her daughter at the time that she was being apprehended by US Marshals and her slave owner. The novel Beloved invites readers to engage in an act of imagination, which is in some ways more important to the task of historical recovery, or is in some ways an even more ethical task than learning the facts of history. The novel Beloved invites readers to engage in acts of radical, impossible, almost supremely ethical, and almost impossibly empathetic acts of imagination. Now, why is this necessary? How does the novel succeed? And are there any historical precedents for this? So, this is something that I'll reflect on eventually, but just now I want to mention one more important fact, which is that the novel Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 1988 and was remarkably well received. It was on the bestseller lists for the longest time. And even today, it's possible to pick up a copy from your nearest bookstore, as long as the bookstores themselves exist. But the point is, thanks to it, the novel being canonized and the novel being a part of official syllabi on American literature and other such things, the novel is guaranteed to have a long afterlife. But there was one controversy which is worth noting, is that in the consideration for the National Book Award Prize for Fiction, the novel was not considered, and several writers, mainly African American but also white writers, wrote a letter of protest. 48 writers, including Maya Angelou, signed and published this signed letter in the New York Times, arguing that Morrison's work was being overlooked due to an institutional racist bias. Now, this is sad to know, but equally important to note, because institutional bias is very real. And institutional bias often takes a very academic form. The academic form of articulating unconsciously or consciously an institutional racist bias usually describes a novel like Beloved, which is about Black lives, about the experience of one Black woman, in terms of form. And this is the kind of discourse about the English novel which deliberately leaves out questions of identity and seeks to evaluate a novel not by reference to the ethnicity or race or nationality of the characters and individuals described, but purely in terms of form. There is a deliberate exclusion of the discourse of race and identity in such language, and on technical grounds, such a novel may be found inferior to a novel that focuses entirely on the lives and aspirations of white Americans. It's possible to find any number of mid to late 20th century American novels that focus entirely on the lives of white people. And we can take an example from this very course, the novel we just finished discussing, Housekeeping. Housekeeping does not discuss race at all. And so, if one were to examine and compare Housekeeping with Beloved purely in terms of technical form, or purely in terms of the kind of sentences, the minimalism of the prose, if one were so inclined, one might argue that Housekeeping is a more accomplished novel. That would be a very sad and inaccurate claim to make. In fact, it would be a completely misplaced and misunderstood claim to make. But a lot of writers were making those claims. A lot of scholars were making those claims in the late 1980s. Today, of course, the discourse, the climate has changed. And this is one area in which scholars of literature must be grateful to the cultural trends of the 20th century, and especially the increasing influence of identity politics as a mode of discernment, as a critical discourse, as a way of thinking which includes and excludes certain narratives based on the identities of the people creating those narratives and the people who are the subjects of these narratives. Today, of course, it's possible to argue that the discourse of identity politics has gone too far. But nonetheless, it's always important to remember that without a positive valuation or without thinking about the ways in which identity shapes lives, writing, narratives, we would not be where we are today, and we would not be able to discuss literature and to read literature the way we do today. I'll make one brief comment before moving on from this topic. At the recently concluded Hay Literature Festival, Zadie Smith makes this observation that identity is this two-way burden. On one hand, it's a privilege and it's an invitation and it's a platform, it's a great opportunity. But on the other hand, identity is a burden and it's a limitation and it's a constraint. And she gives the example of herself and her husband. Herself, she describes as a black writer and argues that in the early 20th century, and in fact, even in the late 20th centuries, when she published her first novel, White Teeth, she kept getting questions and interpretations, and the whole reception of White Teeth was through the perspective of race. And it seemed as if, as a writer, she was an expert on race. And this was a question that she realized that her husband, who's a white writer, was never asked. And so her observation was that for the longest time, white people did not have an identity. And it was only people from Africa, Asia, or other parts of the world, non Caucasians, who seemed to have an identity. And this changed at some point in the 21st centuries when everyone was expected to have an identity and not only to have an identity, but to perform that identity and to include and exclude others based on that identity. So, in a way, Zadie Smith argues that her husband should be happy because he was welcomed into the great conversation, into this great melting pot where everybody is locked into their identities. And at the same time, one consequence of opening up the field of including others was that it also tended to exclude some ways of thinking about identity. If Zadie Smith were to write a novel featuring only white people, it would create a great deal of discomfort and confusion for a lot of people. And that's just one of the consequences, not a terrible consequence, but definitely an inconvenient one. But one cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, identity politics have done a great deal of good, and the small discomfort that they create is to be accepted as part of the many advantages they give us. Now, Morrison's novel, Beloved, is situated roughly at the point when identity politics begins to be accepted. And in fact, Morrison, as a scholar and teacher, has done a great deal towards helping make that change. Morrison has this very important non fictional book called Playing in the Dark. It's about blackness and race in the literary imagination. It describes how readers, without being overtly racist or without having any racist intentions or claims, tend to think in racist ways when they read novels. And this is a consequence of the way the literary industry, the English departments, the syllabi, the reading lists, the publishing industry have been shaped. And because of the kinds of ideas of race that many experts in publishing as well as in academia tend to have. What was this idea? It was a very limited idea. It was this idea that somehow we need to move beyond our identities or write as if our race doesn't matter. And in the Harlem Renaissance, it was rejected. But then in the mid to late 20th century, the idea of embracing race itself appeared to be something that black writers could do only because they were black, because they were part of this Harlem Renaissance, and so on. Morrison argues that race is important because it is a defining human condition. And embracing this defining human condition should empower critics, teachers, and writers to examine the dual nature of race. On one hand, its reality as something that literally shapes human bodies, that literally gives different human bodies identifiable forms. But on the other hand, the very fact that these observable differences are treated as markers of absolute biological difference between human beings. These two ideas. The first one is an acknowledgement of the biological reality of race. The second one is the necessity of criticizing this tendency that just because some people look different, they are different and they are inferior, and that it can be used to criminalize and delegitimize the humanity of some people. Embracing race as an important defining human reality should empower writers to do both of these things. This is one of the claims that Morrison makes in Playing in the Dark. I'll now shift to the novel itself and to examine a very important, actually, undeniably, the most important thing. In fact, the one thing that nobody can forget, even if they haven't read the novel, is that the novel features a ghost. The novel is about a ghost, but it's not a ghost story. It is not a horror story. It is a document of an important task of historical recovery. It is the goal of the novel, the experience and the learning that the novel wants its readers to have is the ability to undertake a task of historical recovery by imagining themselves into the positions of the protagonists. Two of these protagonists are Sethi and Beloved, a mother and daughter pair. Sethi kills her daughter when she's an infant. Beloved enters Sethi's life as a fully grown adult woman whose origins are completely mysterious. In fact, Beloved walks out of the water, just like Jesus, walks out of the water fully formed with unlined skin, sort of the skin that her daughter had when she was a baby, with a mark, with a scar that gives Sethi a clue as to who she might be, and which eventually helps Sethi know that Beloved is the girl who she had killed, the daughter whose life Sethi had taken away from her because she knew what that life was going to be. So, what is this ghost doing? Why is Toni Morrison writing about this ghost? And how does writing about this ghost enable Toni Morrison to flesh out or to recover what was missing from the newspaper clippings and the historical writing about Margaret Garner? To answer this, I'll take a brief detour into some theoretical and non fictional writings, and they have to do with a widespread cultural tendency to recover something. So, slavery is a very complex historical phenomenon because, on one hand, everybody knows that it happened, but on the other hand, nobody knows anything or anything substantial about the actual individuals who were killed. Many individuals were captured and transported from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, a passage which is called the Middle Passage. And transatlantic slavery involved the deaths of many African individuals. These lives were not recorded. Some of their names were recorded. The dates on which some of these people were captured and the dates on which some of these people died were recorded. But beyond that, very little. So, a lot of writers, poets, historians, artists have devoted themselves to this task of imagining ways in which these lives can be remembered, the ways in which these lives can be given meaning beyond a few numbers. So this is something that a lot of writers have been doing, and for a long time. So it's important to situate Morrison's novel Beloved as an intervention in this particular cultural history. One can look very far back, but I think one can begin with J.M.W. Turner's painting The Slave Ship, and I think we can have a visual of the painting on the screen. This painting from 1840 describes a very tragic event in which about 132 slaves were thrown off a ship because the owners of that ship felt that they could claim the full amount of the insurance money. This has become emblematic as one of the most tragic and violent events in the history of transatlantic slavery. It has been immortalized in several narratives. The name of the ship from which these slaves were thrown was first thought to be Zong, Zong. And Turner's painting is among the first narratives, but among more well known are narratives by the poet Norbese Philip from the year 2008 called Zong, Zong. But there are several others as well. And most recently, in the year 2025, the writer and historian Siddharth Kara published this book called Zorg, Zorg. And that book is now destined to be the authoritative and most reliable version of the history and process of this event. The name also has changed, and as Siddharth Kara argues, the name was wrongly understood to be Zong. It's actually Zorg, Zorg. This is one set of narratives. But coming to verbal narratives, there are some powerful instances of writers trying to make sense of this legacy. Among my favorites, and this is a book that also couldn't have been possible without Toni Morrison's Beloved, is the historian Sadiya Hartman's 2007 book, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. Now, Sadiya Hartman is a historian, and like many other historians, is interested in tracing this narrative, tracing the Middle Passage, and not just tracing the Middle Passage, but realizing, fleshing out, adding meaning, adding value to the lives of these individuals who were captured and transported by the Middle Passage. So, in this book, Lose Your Mother, Sadiya Hartman decides to undertake a journey that several African American individuals have undertaken, and it's almost a rite of passage. The journey from wherever they are based in America to that particular location in Africa, from where their ancestors were taken, transported, and enslaved. And basically, it's a sort of homecoming. It's a way of reconciling oneself by visiting the place from which one's ancestors came from. And so this is a very common American ritual, but there's a difference. Now, in most of these typical American rituals, and the book that describes this very powerfully is Alex Haley's book, Roots. Now, most of these popular narratives have a conventional happy ending, which is that upon seeing the space and the location in Africa where this American individual's ancestors came from, the American narrator usually experiences something like closure, something like satisfaction, something like understanding. The process of memory or the process of recovery achieves its desired goal. So Alex Healy, when he sees the place from where his family came, rests assured with the sense that he has now understood who he really is. And this is true for many other narratives. In Sadiya Hartman's book, however, this doesn't happen. Sadiya Hartman's narrator remains disconsolate because at the end of that journey, when she's in Ghana, she doesn't find anything that satisfies her. In fact, what she's confronted with is an even more emptying loneliness because she finds that these individuals who were taken, their lives are not recorded anywhere. Their names are recorded in some ledgers kept by some slave traders, but that's it. Beyond these names, and those names are also in the books of slave owners. So, how meaningful can that be? So, what Hartman is confronted with is an absolute lack. And this is a lack of narratives which give meaning. This is a lack of narratives that give not just meaning but agency. Because the only information that's available records these African individuals already as enslaved. And however further back one goes from that moment of their enslaved identity being recorded, they are always seen in the in this perspective of enslavement, which is they are recognized as an individuals who would soon be enslaved, or later they are recognized as individuals who died as slaves. How to define these individuals, how to recognize these individuals as human beings who had dreams, aspirations, fears, desires, which had nothing to do with the transatlantic slave trade. If this is what Hartman is looking for, if this is what would give Hartman's narrative a true closure and meaning, then it eludes Hartman, and Hartman is faced with an even more deepening existential dread and despair. So the narrative actually doesn't end with her arrival in Ghana, but actually continues much further. In fact, the narrative takes on an intellectual form. It becomes this process of writing about how to think and how to write. And among the key arguments that Hartman makes, and the key formulation that Hartman makes, and which Hartman has written about in every book since then, and she's published quite a few books, is critical fabulation. Now, critical fabulation is a little bit of poetic license that all writers and historians must necessarily take simply because they can feel certain things being recorded, they can sense some things being true, but they have no way of citing any actual written or recorded evidence to back up that claim. So the historian, by definition, must become a little bit like a novelist. And this is because there's no other way for the historian to complete her task as a historian. So, in order to remember things as they were, as they are felt to be true, the historian must become a novelist. I'll stop here and continue discussing how recovery works in Toni Morrison's Beloved in the next lecture. Thank you.